via the University of Arkansas, the Widener University. I want to thank CAPS and the Multicultural Center and also the students. I know that it's challenging oftentimes and a ton of work to invite speakers to come and speak. So I just thank everyone who had a role in me coming, for working on it and inviting me. And this has been a year in the making, if you can imagine. So I just appreciate all of you. In this conversation, I want to place a trigger warning whenever we're having conversations about even sex positivity. There are mentions of anti-Black violence, transphobia, homophobia, COVID-19, racism, sexism, and any of these things could be a potential trigger for the folks who are listening. So my hope is that you will take care of yourselves in the ways that you know how. I also want to acknowledge that we are still very much so in the midst of a pandemic, despite many states in our country wanting to not be in the presence of that reality. We are very much still in a pandemic and also a genocide worldwide against Black people. So I wanted to just acknowledge that the University of Arkansas did not shift any sort of tuition. It did not send home their faculty or professors to go and rest and take care of their families and take care of themselves. We all are working through a pandemic. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, as there are likely people on this call and the people in your life as well who are grieving and mourning at this time. And I just wanted to take a moment to have some sensitivity around that, considering we have lost so many people to COVID-19, and also just in general, that folks may be mourning the life they used to have. We're coming up on a year of living in a pandemic. So mourning looks a lot of different ways. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And again, remind folks to continue to take care of yourselves in the ways that you know how. On the left-hand side, there is a map, and this map is an acknowledgement of Indigenous lands where Arkansas is. The Osage, Quapaw, Caddo, Tunica, and Chickasaw peoples were forcibly removed to create an Arkansas. The University of Arkansas is actually on the Trail of Tears, which was the intentional displacement of Indigenous peoples for the benefit of white supremacist values and institutions, one of which was the University of Arkansas. The University of Arkansas was created due to the Morrill Land Act. The Morrill Land Act said that the federal government can give money to communities to build institutions, forcibly removing Indigenous people from their land. When I went to look up University of Arkansas and its history and how it came to be, it's very challenging to find information on the University of Arkansas and its history. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't Indigenous Africans or Indigenous Americans who built the University of Arkansas. I profoundly believe that that was the case, and that intentional erasure of that history is done so that the University of Arkansas doesn't have to actually account for that harm. But we acknowledge stolen land, not just for acknowledgement's sake, but we acknowledge stolen land to acknowledge the people who still live in present day, right, in Arkansas, who still occupy the land where the University of Arkansas stands. And the University of Arkansas, like every institution where I speak, I look up if that institution has a land acknowledgement anywhere on their website, and if we were in person, if it was anywhere in any of the buildings. And I found that there is a land acknowledgement on the University of Arkansas's website, and it reads similar to if I were to steal Patricia's beautiful chair that they are sitting in right now, and I steal it, and then I go to speak at another university or another institution, and I say, I just want to begin this talk by acknowledging that I stole Patricia's chair, and I want to acknowledge that because I know that they likely missed their chair and they're likely thinking of it. And my acknowledgement is to serve in remembrance of the chair that Patricia used to have that now I will continue to hold. It doesn't make much of a difference if someone just acknowledges harm for acknowledgement's sake without any sort of actions to back up or to account for said harm. So the University of Arkansas's land acknowledgement reads very similar to what if I were to steal Patricia's chair. Patricia is still sitting in their chair. I did not steal their chair. But I'm using that as an example because if you Google land acknowledgement or Osage, Quapaw, Cato land back initiatives in Arkansas, you will find plenty of articles that list the demands that these communities are calling to receive their land back. So, and on the University of Arkansas's website, there was no information as to what are the actions that the University of Arkansas is doing to actually physically give land back. Conversations around land are not theoretical, they are literal. The land does not belong to the University of Arkansas, it never has. So what then do the people who actually own it want to do with that land? Do they consent with the University of Arkansas having an institution there? How many Indigenous professors, Indigenous people, is the president of the University of Arkansas Indigenous? The answer is no, right? But then how are we moving in a direction to actually give the land back? What are the conversations and then actions that the University of Arkansas is taking? And what I found was none, right? Other than a land acknowledgement. The picture on the right-hand side is a picture of redlining. It is a redlining map. These redlining maps actually happen all over the United States as a second form or an extended form of segregation. And what would happen with redlining maps is that banks and real estate companies would say, if you're Black, you're gonna have to live in the red areas. And if you try to live in the blue, the green, or the yellow areas, we're going to deny your bank loan or your home loan to get a mortgage. We're going to keep you from doing that. And the only time we're going to actually accept it is when you apply to live in an area that's in one of the red zones. Now, the red zones were intentionally stripped of any sort of resources, oftentimes built on top of landfills in areas that were environmentally unsafe. And this is where institutionally Black and Latinx communities were pushed to live in. So when I looked to find a redlining map for Fayetteville, Arkansas, where University of Arkansas is, I didn't find one, right? And that's not to say that redlining didn't exist in Fayetteville. And that's also a lesson for anyone that's researching anything in terms of anti-Black racism in this country. Just because it doesn't exist on the internet, right, where a lot of our algorithms are run by racist institutions and to give them money so they alter information so that it's favorable to whatever they are positioning themselves as. Be mindful that the internet does not have all the answers. A lot of this information has also been intentionally erased to the point where it might not even be written in a book. So just because the Fayetteville map, redlining map, did not exist or does not exist on the internet does not mean that redlining did not happen in Fayetteville. Actually, when I went to look up Fayetteville, Fayetteville's median household income is $220,000 a year. Fayetteville is also 76% white. When I looked up the median household income in Arkansas, I found that for a family, it was $46,000. So Fayetteville is almost quadruple the median household for Arkansas. Pine Bluff, which is a predominantly Black community 3 hours away from Fayetteville, is 75% Black, and the median household income is $34,000. The president of University of Arkansas, according to records in 2018, made $510,000 a year. So what I'm pointing to is whenever there is mass wealth inequity, there is racial injustice. They literally go hand in hand. The fact that the president of the school is making $510,000, which is, 5 times more than the median household of the entire state, but consistent with Fayetteville, Arkansas, right? A predominantly white area. The reason why we have predominantly white areas that have mass wealth inequity has everything to do with redlining, the past of redlining and the future that is gentrification. Redlining went away, huge quotations, went away with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. However, still to this day, there is racist practices in housing, right? Home loans are still being denied to Black people, regardless of where they want to live, as if these maps still very much exist. Black people are still being pushed out of their communities so that white people can live there. And we call that gentrification. So I wanted to highlight the ways in which displacement of Indigenous communities, Indigenous Americans, also Indigenous Africans who were also impacted by the Trail of Tears. And that's something that isn't something that is talked about very often, but also the displacement of Black people in terms of redlining and how that greatly impacted wealth, right, in this country. The ways in which Black people are able to build generational wealth, considering we weren't able to have homes, we weren't able to actually build that wealth that a home does, that investment does. And we were pushed into areas where we didn't have access to quote unquote good schools. I say quote unquote because all schools should be good. They shouldn't be labeled as good or bad. In these neighborhoods that still exist to this day, right? I don't have to do much research on Pine Bluff, but I'm assuming the resources in Pine Bluff look very different than they do in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The access to hospitals are far and few in between. Black people have to travel almost the furthest distances to get to medical institutions that support them. And then these medical institutions also will be riddled with medical racism. What are the food access like? What are the grocery stores in Pine Bluff in compared to Fayetteville, Arkansas, right? And I'm sure even within Fayetteville, there are pockets of what we would call predominantly Black areas, and they are stricken of any sort of wealth support. They are oftentimes built on wealth disparity. And what people do is that they lump Blackness with poorness rather than considering how did that come to be. And redlining is an example of that. And so is the displacement of Indigenous communities. When I talk about redlining and the displacement of Indigenous people in this country, sometimes I get questions of, where else is this happening in the world and what can we do? The Case for Reparations is an article written by Ta-Nehisi Coates in June 2014, where he very explicitly talks about the institution of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, racist housing practices like redlining, and how that all impacted Black Americans' ability to live, right? To actually thrive in this country, to survive in a country that created institutions, even when slavery was outlawed, still worked against them. So the Case for Reparations is a demand from the state, of the state being the United States, to give Black people money, the money that they would have actually been able to have if these institutions weren't in place. Institutions like chattel slavery, redlining, Jim Crow, etc. I highly recommend that you read that article when you have a second. This is a headline from December 11th, 2019, and it talks about how in the city of Boston, they are going to bulldoze Harriet Tubman's house to make condominiums. So I wanted to illustrate further the insidious nature of gentrification and how it doesn't even cultivate some of our most profound American heroes' legacy in terms of what they left behind or what what we're able to preserve. The state doesn't care to preserve that. It cares to create condominiums that white people will essentially be able to live in. These condominiums are not for Black people. They're not being built with some sort of lower rent charges. Boston is also a predominantly white area for the same reasons that Fayetteville is a predominantly white area. Palestine Belongs to Palestine is a graphic created by Unapologetically Black or Unapologetically Brown series, where they talk about lots of things, but one of which they talk about is standing in solidarity with Palestinian people as Palestine is occupied by Israel. And the United States has stood in support of this occupation for hundreds of years. And it's important that in standing in solidarity with Black communities in this country and standing against the racist housing practices that continue to happen to this day, it's important that we also look to the other ways in which other countries have used the same systems, the same rhetoric, the same harmful practices of colonization. And Israel and Palestine is a perfect example of that, and that trauma and pain that continues to happen from a country that believes it owns another country. This graphic on the far right corner says, release the aid, cancel the debt, decolonize Puerto Rico. If you're unfamiliar, the United States has Puerto Rico as a commonwealth. So in other words, it owns Puerto Rico. If you remember when Donald Trump was president, there was a massive hurricane by the name of Hurricane Maria that destroyed a lot of the island of Puerto Rico. And with a lot of resistance, Donald Trump traveled to Puerto Rico, essentially throwing paper towels at the people and disparaging the debt, claiming that it was Puerto Rico's fault that they were in debt, when in fact the United States has stripped all of the resources from Puerto Rico in owning the country, right? So again, we have this example of how a country is taking everything from a country that they quote unquote own and then blaming them for all of its problems. You see this as well in the United States, where white people and white institutions will blame Black people for where they are forced to live and forced to exist, oftentimes in wealth, disparaged communities, and there is no accountability, there are no actions, there are no reparations to then shift that reality. The blame is solely placed on the most marginalized, while the folks who are most privileged are able to continue on with their lives in a way that feels good for them without ever actually accounting for the trauma that they continue to benefit from. I was already introduced a little bit, but I just wanted to run it on back because I know I've been talking to you for at least the past 15 minutes. Again, my name is Ericka Hart. My pronouns are she and they. You can use them interchangeably. You can use one or the other. As long as they are she and they, those pronouns affirm me. I am Black, a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade. I make this point as Blackness is not a monolith. We all come to this country in various ways, and I think it's important for me to acknowledge the way in which my family came to this country non-consensually, and another way for me to honor my ancestors. And although we came here non-consensually and were harmed greatly in the process, I am incredibly proud of my ancestry and the people that I come from. I am queer. That is how I love. That is also my politic. That is how I see the world. I am a non-binary femme. I do not identify as a woman or a lady. I am poly-adjacent. This is a term that I completely made up. I identify as polyamorous, but I fell in love with someone and got very confused. So I say that I'm poly-adjacent, still holding on to the idea that there is not just one love that you will have, but there are multiple loves that you can have, and you can have those multiple loves at one time. I am kinky, or what feels good for me in terms of kink or BDSM is being a sub or service bottom. It feels very good for me to care for other people. And this is something that I do in my kink dynamics. I place this here even in an academic setting because oftentimes people like to remove the expression of sexuality from academia as if that's not the place for it. But I actually think it's important, if we have the privilege to acknowledge what, you know, feels good for our bodies, why not, you know, to really how do I want to say this? I want to curse, but I'm trying not to. I guess that's consistent with what I want to say. Really fuck with respectability is what I want to say. I am neurodivergent. I have anxiety. I'm a white neighborhood and predominantly white institution survivor. I have only gotten this question one time of what does that mean? As a Black person, navigating predominantly white spaces can be incredibly traumatic and oftentimes is. And over again, I have had to navigate those spaces and I have survived them. So that's why I have that there. I am a sexual assault survivor. I am a breast cancer survivor, and I have my master's of human sexuality. I have been teaching sex ed for the past 11 years with a focus in gender and racial and social justice. And I'm also a Sagittarius, and we are the best sign. I'm sorry, I won't debate anybody on that. I think it's important in a country where certain privileges are valued over, or certain identities are valued over others, to acknowledge where my privilege is and how that also colors my politic. I come from an upper to middle class background. I have an invisible disability. So if you do not see me topless, like the picture on the left-hand side, you will likely not know that I'm a breast cancer survivor. I am brown skinned. So in a conversation around colorism, it's important for me to acknowledge that I am not dark skinned and I am also not light skinned. And there is privilege of being brown skinned. And there's also disadvantages of being brown skinned, but it doesn't look like the experiences of someone who is dark skinned or light skinned. I have educational privilege. I have my high school diploma, my bachelor's degree, and a master's degree. I have no criminal background. I have pretty privilege. Pretty privilege is this idea that you can use how you look to get favor, to get jobs, to get opportunities. If you see my double mastectomy scars, they don't keloid. At the bottom, you'll see that I have small fat. So I'm shaped in a particular way that people still will lift up and find attractive. All of that gives me the opportunity to be topless, and my pictures go viral on the internet, when there are multiple thousands of people who have shown their double mastectomy scars and have not gone viral. I don't want it to be, well, Ericka's this special specimen. No, I have pretty privilege, and that's why it goes viral. I have chosen and nuclear family. I place this here because as a queer, non-binary person, it's important for me to acknowledge that I have chosen family, folks that I am not blood related with. And I have a nuclear family, folks that I am blood related with that accept me and my queer and non-binary identity. I am cisgender passing. I grapple with this, but I'm oftentimes related to as if I am a woman or a lady. And that is not to say that there is a way to look trans or non-binary. However, there are ways that folks relate to or assume that certain folks are trans and non-binary, and that's not the way that I'm related to. I am a documented US citizen. I am an English speaker and also conversational in Spanish. I am young-ish, and my body shape is small fat. Small fat is an identity within the fat activist movement that relates to fatness on a scale from fatness rather than from thin to fat, really ending this idea that fatness is something to move away from and thinness is the ideal. So small fat, and if you speak African-American vernacular because you are Black and only because you are Black, thick, but we can argue that as well. Some assumptions about this presentation. One of which is that this is not a diversity and inclusion conversation. This is also not an advocate. I'm not being an advocate for diversity and inclusion. I think oftentimes diversity and inclusion is placed in institutions to absolve that institution of the harm that they have caused, thus bringing Black and non-Black POC to the institution without actually acknowledging the harm that's been caused and dealing with that harm. They're then placing Black and non-Black POC in a harmful space. This is an actual panel that happened in 2018. It was an all-white panel addressing the lack of diversity in corporate America. So still what you have is white people saying what is diverse or what is diverse enough, while they are still the foundation of the institution. The existence of whiteness is still there. White supremacy is still present. We've just added Black people, and that now is supposed to be better. And that is oftentimes how diversity and inclusion will operate. This is also not a Black excellence conversation. This is not going to highlight the countless Black people who have come through University of Arkansas or have graduated from college in the United States. And I just think that this gif or meme is funny when you wake up from 1779 and see Black people having mad fun outside. So we are not going to, put the spotlight on Black folks and highlight their achievements in some sort of way to say, well, racism is gone and now we can move forward because we have Obama and Beyonce and Kamala Harris. That is not this presentation. So I just want to make that clear. This tweet says slavery would have been abolished so much faster if they just had slavery open data. Slave owner transparency would have avoided a civil war and saved countless lives. Abolitionists should have demanded spreadsheets with tabular slavery data stored in plain text format data. I have this here because oftentimes what happens when we're having a conversation about anti-Black racism, people will ask for evidence. People will ask for what are the examples of racism that have happened here, further traumatizing the harmed, the people who have experienced said racism. It also puts the burden of proof on the harmed to then prove that an institution is racist, rather than actually acknowledging the experience that one person had. It doesn't require 15 people. It doesn't require 100 people. One person is entirely too much being harmed. So then what are we doing about it? And this tweet really emphasizes the fact that even if there was data on slavery, that doesn't mean that it would have been abolished faster. Even if there was plenty of evidence, which there was, right, for slavery to end, that wouldn't have had slavery end any faster. I tell you the story of Laquan McDonald, who was murdered in Chicago by a police officer who had over 100 complaints against him about racism. And still, Laquan McDonald lost his life. Even though the data was present about that police officer, they still did not intervene and do something about it, to the point where now it's entirely too late that Laquan McDonald is no longer with us. No longer able to create a family, no longer able to walk down the street, have relationships, have breakups, have sex, right? None of these things are possible now because there wasn't any paying attention to the data, but then it also wasn't a care for any sort of data because there's a constant cover up of many institutions inside of white supremacy to continue causing harm as long as they are not caught. When they are caught, diversity and inclusion office sparks up, rather than actually acknowledging, okay, this police officer, perhaps police officers in general, need to no longer exist, right? We are not at that conversation of consequence in this country. Consequence is not something that the United States or any white imperialist or colonized state is interested in engaging with. So the title of this workshop is Joy through radical sex positivity. And I think we have to take, 1,000 steps back before we even begin to, as Salt and Pepper sang so perfectly, and Rat, let's talk about sex. As when we are dealing with an anti-Black world, an anti-Black institution, we have to first acknowledge what are the ways in which certain bodies are regarded in this institution, and how then does that impact their access to pleasure? How does that impact their access to pleasure if they're not even able to go to school in a way that feels good for them? If they're not able to go to school without being harmed? If they're not able to teach without losing their job or fear of losing their job because they're Black, right? So we have to start there and then begin to piece apart how are these particular barriers in the way of folks accessing pleasure? This is a white supremacist graphic, or not a white supremacist graphic. It is a graphic illustrating white supremacy, a graphic illustrating white supremacy. And it is a free graphic online. It is called a white supremacy iceberg, where, you have the unfortunate example of how icebergs actually work to the Titanic's demise, right? The Titanic saw the little piece of ice sticking out of the ocean and said, you know what, I think we'll be fine if we hit it, not realizing there was a whole iceberg situation under the water that they could not see. So similar to white supremacy, we have what you can see, overt white supremacy, what is oftentimes called socially unacceptable. It is usually regarded as something that needs to be addressed immediately. And then you have covert white supremacy, which operates without any sort of consequence or oftentimes any acknowledgement. There's lots of presentations and lectures done on covert white supremacy or what's socially acceptable, but rarely do we see that there is an interruption to covert white supremacy. Some questions that I get about covert white supremacy on this, well, what's on this? And just to let you know, there's no reason for the words on the outside of the triangle. They just didn't fit on the inside of it. This is also not an exhaustive list of all the things that could actually be present on this particular graphic, right? There's so many more things that we can add. Some questions that I get about this is, what is bootstrap theory? Bootstrap theory is this idea that you're supposed to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you work really hard, get your education, you will be able to have the house with the white picket fence and the 4-door sedan with your family, right? And that is just not the case in the United States. There's lots of barriers to that reality, right? To even achieving that we've already discussed. Racist housing practices, racist organizational practices, the ways in which our access to health is not equitable in this country through insurance, to all the way up to medical racism. So we have to be thinking about all of those things and get that bootstrap theory is not something that's actually possible. Paternalism, this is when people in positions of authority or power restrict the freedoms of autonomy of those whom they consider subordinate to them and the presumed best interests of the subordinate, i.e. for their own good. Example of this is slave owners would use paternalism to justify slavery. So they'd say things like to slaves, to enslaved people, it's better for you if you stay here, freedom and liberty is removed, you have no choice in the matter, right? I'm sure the University of Arkansas has done things like this, particularly with the Fulbright statue that is still prominent on campus. Many students since pretty much the 1950s have been advocating for the removal of the Fulbright statue, but the University of Arkansas, even just recently, as of 2020, said, we're going to create more conversations, and that's what's best for all of you, is that if we have a closed door conversation with a select few of people about, anti-Black racism and the fact that the Fulbright statue is still there, we wash our hands of it, that should be sufficient. That is an example of paternalism. Virtuous victim narrative. this idea, an example of this is when people say, you know, immigrants should be able to live here. They provide so much to this country, to the economy. They work so hard. They should be allowed to stay, rather than this is actually stolen land and anyone can come to this country. It is not owned by anyone unless we get permission from indigenous communities, right? It is, immigrants are oftentimes indigenous to this country anyway, right? When we're talking about the United States is a political landmass. We're talking about America, right, or Turtle Island, Canada, the United States, Mexico, and parts of Central America. That is all indigenous land. Like every land across the world is owned by indigenous communities. And whenever we're saying, oh, this particular immigrant can't come and that immigrant can come, they oftentimes look different in terms of racial background. And when the immigrant is Black or brown, there's lots of conversations of what sort of labor they contribute to the country, rather than, hey, I actually think that anyone can come to this country because this country is these sort of fences or barriers are all made up politically. They're not actual real lines. They were created to keep particular people out and to keep white people from coming in. So I think it's important to engage in a conversation around where race came from, right? This primordial question, the chicken or the egg question inside of racial and social justice is, what came first, race or racism? What is race? What does that actually mean beyond it being a social construct and the sort of organizing principle that rules most of our lives? Those of us who live in previously colonized nation states or countries. Any conversation about race or racism has to begin with the creation of whiteness as a basis for it. So before racism, there was white. And whiteness was created also as a binary, good, bad, better or worse, the antithesis to Black. A way to justify economic exploitation of Black people, the harbinger for request. And what would justify why conquest was necessary by the Portuguese, British, or Spanish in the 16th and 17th centuries? The formation of a dominant authoritarian being who had license by virtue of their whiteness to, quote, take over the world through violent means and to control global trade of goods from sugar or white gold, as British imperialist colonizers called it, to coffee, all the way up to human beings through violent means. So when we talk about whiteness, we're talking about not only people who think of themselves as white, because not only is race a social construct, as in there is no biological basis for it, whiteness is a social construct that enjoys widespread social, cultural, and economic agreement for its dominance inside of an assumed hierarchical norm, which is describing a term called hegemony or imperialism. An example of hegemony is all presidents of this country have been white with the exception of one, and there has been no national outcry about it. Domestic terrorism is oftentimes caused by white nationalist groups that are run by white cis men, and they do not hold the stereotype of having a propensity to violence, despite empirical data to suggest otherwise. But Black folks are constantly called violent. Folks tend to get tripped up by the fact that there is no genetic, biological, or otherwise scientific basis for race, which is understandable since race has been such an organizing principle in our lives. So entrenched in our structures, from who works where, pay gap between Black cis women and white men, who lives where, or even who gets to go to school where, and how those schools look, access to resources, etc. It can almost seem like race was intrinsic or natural. Well, there has to be a genetic difference between races. Look at skin color. Pseudoscientists have used brain size, skull size, average IQ, physical strength, how fast a person can run, etc., all to prove that race was in fact a real thing, that white people were in fact better than Black people, and that they needed to be enslaved. And none of this is true, right? Humans are about 0.1% different genetically. Phenotype is a person's observable traits like hair color, eye color, skin color, pigment, etc. Now, phenotype has a genetic component. The social meaning of darker skin or a larger nose was later attached to support racism, a globalized system of power. Another example of hegemony is the anti-Asian, anti-immigrant xenophobia during this time, which is a direct byproduct of little to no response in the normalization of anti-Black sentiments and acts of anti-Black racial aggression that occurs on a normal basis of hating Black people with little to no consequence. If anti-Black racism is never addressed, that then leaves other identities who are also not white left to also be targeted. So one group having dominance over all others, we all somehow just believe that this is the norm. Whiteness also has become a political identity that has taken shape over time. Blue collar, white collar, middle American Yankee, Confederate, liberal, neoliberal. When white people get upset, they are called fragile, not angry. Overall, though, it is a system and conditioning that people subscribe to or prescribe to others. For example, you see this often in colorism. And just a heads up, you have all of these examples at the bottom. I took my video off so you're able to just focus on the screen and also screenshot. So you have definitions of what white race, racism, and colorism also is on the screen. Overall, though, colorism is the unfair mistreatment based on skin tone, proximity to whiteness, scale from Black to white. Another way the dominant culture has instituted racism is that light-skinned people are more valuable, more desirable in immigration across cultures and ethnicities. An example of this is darker skinned Puerto Ricans, but also Black Latinx people across Latinx countries. Another example of this is when the United States talks about immigration, they oftentimes create this image that it is only white or light-skinned immigrants, and there's rarely any conversation about Haitian immigrants or immigrants from Jamaica or immigrants from Southeast Asia. The conversation around immigrants looks like a lighter skin or white immigrants, and that also has a lot to do with the storytelling or the narrative making around those immigrants. We can never, ever, ever leave out colorism when discussing racism. Lighter skinned Black and non-Black POC will be placed in positions of power to absolve institutions of their racism, while the darker skinned folks remain the custodial staff. You may see this at University of Arkansas, landscapers, groundskeepers, security. We see these trends in terms of how students are also punished in school, as well as darker skinned Black girls especially are given harsher consequences for similar behavioral incidents as their lighter skinned counterparts. I'm not familiar with what are the demographic breakdowns at the University of Arkansas. It's actually very, very hard to find, but I want to leave a reminder here that only 95% or 95% of Indigenous Africans who were stolen from Africa for the purpose of chattel slavery were brought to Latin America. Only 5% went to the US. So Black history is rich amongst Latinx communities and has been intentionally erased. You might even consider folks in the US who can identify as Hispanic or Latinx without pushout is a privilege. The ability to speak, quote, proper Spanish or being raised in Catholicism. People who are raised as Black or Indigenous oftentimes have to prove they are Latinx. It's important in racial and social justice work, we call things what they are, not their pseudoscientific terms. White, not to be confused with the popular term, which is kind of treated like a euphemism now, the pseudo-scientific quasi-anthropological term Caucasian, named so after the Caucasus Mountains that sit just north of Turkey. The pseudoscientist Blumenbach said that the beautiful Caucasus Mountains rivaled the ugly Mongoloid mountains, which were used to broadly describe people from Asia. And there's no such thing, I might blow your mind with this, no such thing as a Caucasian person. There's also no such thing as an Anglo-Saxon, and you can read all of that from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Not all white people descend from the Caucasus Mountains in Turkey, and just because you're white doesn't mean you have Turkish ancestry. Much of our world is driven by the hatred and disgust of Black people, which is called anti-Black racism. It is a culture and a standard. It is a political alliance that would have Trump be elected and impeached 2 times, but not actually able to be impeached, but acquitted on both of those impeachment trials. He was never fired for his racism. This same standard, anti-Black standard, would also have cause for the transatlantic slave trade, would also be the reason that Fulbright's statue still stands in the middle of University of Arkansas. You may have heard people say things like, you're playing the race card, or race is not important. I don't see color, or I'm colorblind. We live in a post-racial society circa 2008 after Barack Obama's presidency, or now with Kamala Harris as vice president. Well, the reason people say that, and what they mean by that, is that white people get to exist in a way that is unraced, an unmarked category, a tabula rasa onto which humanity is. Instead of racism being a problem vis-a-vis the very nature of Black people's presence in the space, muddying this blank slate called white, called American. In this case, Black people cannot be racist, right? And I think it's, imperative that this is said, because I think oftentimes people will say, well, if a Black person says that they do not like white people, then that then makes them a racist. And that is not the case, right? Black people do not have the institutional power to be racist. If you look at the definition on the screen, racism, that is applying race prejudice while having race privilege to maintain dominant systems of power and white supremacy. I'm gonna now show you this video with Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is now an ancestor. And she was an author, a writer, and a speaker, and she oftentimes wrote about, most of her work is about the experience of Blackness, anti-Black racism. And this interview that she did in the 1980s is pretty powerful, and how, the same questions are being asked of Black people is, what can white people do? And I think she answers it perfectly.
Judge me by my deeds.
That's right.
Arthur Ashe was here, the late Arthur Ashe, yes. And he said to me, as he said in one other place, he said, in a much quoted comment, he said, living with AIDS is easier than living racist. It's a harder struggle against racism for me than it is against AIDS. What it meant to me is that there's no way for the rest of us to understand that daily encounter. Which brings me to my question to you. Do you still have that encounter? Do you, Toni Morrison, Pulitzer Prize winner, successful, honored in the halls of academia, etc., still have that encounter?
Yes, I do, Charlie, but let me tell you, that's the wrong question.
Okay, what's the right question?
How do you feel? Not you, Charlie Rose, but don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism, are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy. It is crazy. And it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people, and possibly equal as it does Black people. I always knew that I had the moral high ground all my life. I always thought those people who said I couldn't come in the drugstore and I had to sit in this funny place, I couldn't go in the park.
Superior to them
I
from
did.
day one.
And I thought they knew that I knew that they were inferior to me morally. I always thought that. And my parents always thought that.
You said your father was racist because he always felt like he was
He always
superior.
felt, that's right. He always felt superior. And that was a form, of defensive racism. But if the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race, it's also constructed, it's also made, and it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away. And there you are, all strung out. And all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? Still smart? You still like yourself? I mean, these are the questions. It's part of it is, yes, the victim, how terrible it has been for Black people.
Like
I'm not a victim. I refuse to be one.
and the victim is the other person who is morally inferior. And
that's a
has
serious
to hold
question.
On to
of course.
racism
If you have to hold, that's
for his or her own self-esteem and definition.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
Then give white people some free advice.
They're all in my books.
So again, race is a social construct. There is no biological basis for it. It has a very, very real impact on people's everyday lives. It does not give you license to ignore its impacts. And depending on where you fall, its advantages and disadvantages. Again, racism was created to uphold white supremacy. I'm gonna skip through this. This is just quickly white supremacy culture. I think all of you should look up a document called White Supremacy Culture, created by Kenneth Jones. I have the tag at the bottom. And let me move this. By Tima Okun, Change Work. And so when we're talking about, white supremacy, right, I feel that a lot of the term has been watered down in a lot of ways, and that we are relating to it as something, again, like it's only the overt actions, but not considering the fact that it is 100% a culture, a way of being. So culturally, white supremacy will demand perfectionism, something that is unattainable, right? I remember when I got B's and C's in high school, and it was after my mom had passed away when I was 13. My dad said, B's and C's are good, but you can do better. Not acknowledging or considering, like, I have been through a traumatic year, and perhaps B's and C's are not something that I need to, that's the best thing that I was going to attain. And that A's are not something that I have to then reach for, right? I'm doing the best that I can. But for him, it's always, A is what you need to be getting. That's perfect. That is the perfect grade. Anything less than that is unacceptable, right? And you see this in institutions. That's not just my dad. You see this in institutions across the country where A's are celebrated and B's and C's, and even failing a class is something to be ashamed of, right? It's something to then be looked down upon. Worship of the written word, we're going to get into that a little bit, of this idea that it's not written, it's written down in our handbook. There's no sort of writing about hate speech at University of Arkansas, and the little that's written there is all that we're going to acknowledge, and we're not going to change it. That's the worship of the written word, and it's very consistent with white supremacy culture to not actually change anything or to have any sort of consequences. Paternalism, you're seeing again that positions of power get to denote what's best for those who are the subordinates, right? Power hoarding. So again, those closed door meetings about racial or anti-racism that no one gets to listen in on, that no one gets to be a part of except for the select few. The power hoarding also with, a president making almost $1 million, right? $510,000 a year. And I'm assuming the custodians at University of Arkansas do not make that. Fear of open conflict. So everything needs to be very tone policed and controlled. No one should be yelling or getting angry. Everyone needs to be speaking at a particular volume, and no one should be able to see any sort of conflict. They should be, handled very quickly. So I want you to go and find this document. It's free. It's a free PDF online. Read it, and then also get interested in where white supremacy culture is showing up in your workspace, where it's showing up at the University of Arkansas in your classrooms, amongst your peers, in your dorm room, wherever that might be. I'll read you this quote on the, the right-hand side. And this is by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it says, but all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all lands with great violence upon the body. And this is a reminder that as much as we can talk about this, I want to bring you back by how this lives in people's bodies, that there is intergenerational trauma, that there is trauma that happened to folks yesterday, right? And the experience of this, we can theorize and have lots of conversations about it, but at the end of the day, this is people's lives that are having to experience white supremacy on a regular basis, to navigate it on a regular basis. And how are we caring for one another to the point where we're saying white supremacy can no longer exist here? I mentioned this at the beginning, the statue of J. William Fulbright, who the school is also named after, is still standing erect at the University of Arkansas. Fulbright said yes to the Southern Manifesto, which was essentially against segregation. He also voted against the 1957 Civil Rights Act. He refused to speak out against Governor Orville Faubus, who sent the National Guard to block the 9 students who were integrating the Little Rock High School. He voted against the 1964 Equal Accommodations Act. There's more that he did that I have here. He did a lot of stuff that is very arguably a mess, right? J. William Fulbright, is lauded as this person that was a contradiction, right? Was this person that, because he voted against all of these things and said that he didn't want to jeopardize his constituency and how they felt about segregation, that's why he was in that position as a senator for over 30 years. And then goes to support the United Nations, creating the Fulbright Scholar. And people will say that that's a contradiction, but actually from where I'm standing, it's consistent with being a blatant bigot, right? If you're standing for segregation and fighting against that, if you are calling John F. Kennedy after the murder of 4 children in a church, and you are then voting against the Civil Rights Act thereafter and attending filibusters, and then you go on to create a scholarship program that sends Americans to other countries to study under the guise of that it will end a nuclear war or it will not have nuclear wars happen, while also disparaging certain countries like the Congo, where he said, quote, the Congo is not a place that can actually handle the financial aid and support that the United States could give, but the continent of Europe could actually do that. And that's why we're sending students to Europe to have an exchange of ideas. Now, as a former Peace Corps volunteer, this reeks of imperialism, and someone who is interested in segregation and is committed to anti-Black racism institutionally and will not speak out against it for fear of alienating the white people who potentially kept him in power, while there was also Black people living in the state of Arkansas. So to say that I'm not going to speak out against my constituency directly ignores the Black people who are also present there. So for me, your website says that the history is a contradiction and that they speak out against it. But what would actually show that there is a stand against anti-Black racism from the University of Arkansas would be to remove the Fulbright statue and also to remove his name from the school's website. But again, and from the naming of the school, right? But again, I want y'all to understand how often institutions will hold on to white supremacy, right? There is no consequence for being a white supremacist in this country. And University of Arkansas has the opportunity to set the groundwork, right? To really lay out, hey, we're gonna operate much differently. We are going to be the staple. We are going to be the example of what it looks like to right our wrongs, to give land back to Indigenous communities, to no longer be in ties with any sort of white supremacist institution in terms of being named that way. And that's not happening. So then what you have is a continuation of that harm. The fact that Black people have to then take to Twitter and social media and share their everyday experiences attending University of Arkansas as students, and some also as faculty. And I unfortunately see these Instagram accounts, Black at, insert the institution. In this case, we have Black at University of Arkansas, where Black students are sharing their experiences. But far too often do I see these Instagram accounts pop up, and that this is the only place where Black people actually get to be seen and heard. And even that, in the comments, you'll still have a racist person come in and try to deny the experiences. But what is the institution doing actually in action to take care of the Black people who attend that school, right? To say, I don't think it's gonna feel good for any Black person to see the presence of someone who, essentially voted against segregation that would have them not even attend the school. I don't think that any, Black person wants to attend a school where the school is named after someone who voted against the Fair Housing Act that ended redlining, right? I don't think that that's going to be a major trigger for folks. And if there's a major trigger for people, then that is also going to impact their possibility of pleasure, but also their ability to attend school. So I want to leave you with this to lift up the narratives that Black people share, to believe the narratives that Black people share. And if you are a professor or a faculty member, or maybe the president is listening to this, that you get in action around the needs of your students in a way that actually shows them that they're cared for and that their presence is welcomed. And oftentimes that experience is not a reality. And this goes beyond students as well. Black faculty, the custodians, the folks who work in the front office, the folks who are oftentimes forgotten, but also hold the identities of Black. And if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I'm not Black, I'm not having those experiences. If it's happening to Black people, no one is safe, right? Anti-Black racism doesn't just impact Black people. It makes the experiences for everybody horrible. It just puts Black people at the margins of the experience. It doesn't mean that you are safe in anti-Black racism if you are not Black. I leave you with this final quote by one of my teachers, one of my favorite educators and authors and poet, a Black lesbian who died of breast cancer in the 1990s, Audre Lorde. And she writes, I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. So my final word is that I dedicate this to the Black students who continue to speak out, even for fear of it being misunderstood or risk of being harmed, is that you continue to, Black faculty, you continue to speak out and continue to share your experiences such that the institution shifts, but also so you don't have to carry the burden of that experience. You don't have to sit in silence with what you're experiencing. You're always able to share what's there for you. And that's my time, everyone. Thank you so much. I think we're now going to open it up to questions, so I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you, everyone.
Ericka, just whoa, gratitude and admiration. Thank you for coming and telling us about ourselves. These are things that probably some of us or many of us knew some of, right? And I learned a lot, as I expected to. Thank you for being willing to take questions from us. If you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself. And I hope, Ericka, you're seeing Casey saying, I can't even express how happy this made me today. So you're breathing life into a dark space, you know. Yeah. So you might be happy to know also that I assume it's a student. Somebody draped the Fulbright statue today, actually with a black curtain, and put a sign that said, I know. And a sign, what did the sign say? We need a statue of somebody that's not a segregationist, something to that effect. There you go. Enriquez is doing old school screen share where you hold your phone up to the screen. There you go.
That is amazing. Shout out to that person. That's amazing.
No kidding.
That's amazing. They should not have had to do that. The school should have just did that. But
agreed.
Badass.
Agreed.
Yep.
Okay, well, in the absence of questions from other folks, these came to me. I just share these came to me from Adrian. These are not questions a white lady wrote. You know, I'm not trying to power hoard here. Okay, so you talked about so many of these things already. Would you mind telling us what, thank you, Khadija Sign says, in need of new statute, preferably not a segregationist. Yes. Yes. What are you reading right now for us to, you know, try to get to your level? You shared so many clips to start and places to start or to continue, but what else are you reading for pleasure or work or both?
You know, honestly, a big part of I read like 4 books at once, but a big part of my work is to read and reread history and then find history written by Indigenous people and Black people. Because oftentimes our history is written by white folks. And you have, you know, very colorful ways. Like when I was reading about Fulbright, it said that, you know, there's lots of contradictions, and the reason why he had to be a segregationist was this and that. And it's like, no, like he was just a racist, right? And that's it. So, you know, reading the works from Indigenous people. Let me see what I have around me. These are good. I mean, these are all over the place, but then not bad. So I read and reread this over and over again. Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. And you might think, well, how does this apply to schools? But schools actually fill prisons all the time through the school to prison pipeline or the cradle to prison pipeline. And this is just a great reminder of how to not mimic policing structures and institutions, but also in your life, right? Another Angela Davis is Women, Race, and Class. Great history lesson in here, breakdown of the ways in which institutions, but also the institution of chattel slavery greatly harmed Indigenous African women, right? Or what were gendered as women. And then also a lot of conversations around white feminism. But again, it has, you know, a lot of my work is just, you know, what really happens in this situation and whose story is not being told, and then doing a lot of research from that point.
Yeah, we got to hear from Angela Davis a couple of weeks ago. She spoke. It was incredible.
That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. And then Mickey Kendall spoke to a group, a union professionals group yesterday. That was also, but you know, schools are like prisons in too many places in our communities. We have a question from Casey. Can you speak more to how fear of open conflict and how it shows up in organizations and systems?
Fear of open conflict. So what I've seen oftentimes is that instead of the school having or instead of a conversation, if a professor says the N-word in class and a student calls that out, the school will intervene and try to calm down the situation rather than just having, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation about this where you say what you need to say and you say where you need to say. And then the professor is removed, right, for using the N-word because that is hate speech, right? It's open conflict. It's not something that's done behind closed doors. There's not a conversation that's had with the professor behind closed doors or the student behind closed doors. It's all out in the open. So that folks there's not a lot of speculation as to what happened, but it gets resolved. And, you know, fear of open conflict has a lot to do with maintaining reputation, which is what a lot of institutions like to do. They like to slap on that they're an anti-racist organization by doing very little, but they just get to call themselves that.
Right.
And they get to hide all the ways that they've had conflict. Right? They don't want any of that to be seen. If you start to call out an institution on Twitter, they will quickly respond to you because they don't want it seen, right? So that's that fear of open conflict and how it plays a role all the time. Instead of, if I call my insurance company and say, hey, I'm actually not getting my chemotherapy approved, and they say, well, you're not getting it approved because whatever reason, I go on Twitter and say they're actually denying me my chemotherapy. Immediately they will find a way to stop the conflict, right? And I saw that similar with the University of Arkansas, Black at University of Arkansas call out, is immediately there was, you know, professors, you know, people in charge responding to people's experiences rather than when they made these claims, not on Twitter, right? Not on a large platform, they weren't heard to the point where they felt that they needed to go to a large platform. So those are just a few examples of how institutions will try to move away from the fear of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. That happens here all the time. Do you mind, this is another question that we got, I wonder if I can make a connection, and if you don't want to talk about this particular thing, your call, obviously. But is that what's been going on as it relates to what's happened at Columbia in the last couple of weeks in terms of the dean, right? And I was scrolling through the Instagram and the 700 comments last night, the situation at Columbia, right, where something happened and then the dean held a meeting where you weren't invited, right?
Yeah.
To talk about the conflict that you were involved in.
Yeah. Yeah, there was actually, so I called the school out, and then they
Right.
had a meeting about me without me, to talk about their feelings, right? So again, it's the fear of open conflict. Why wasn't I invited to that meeting to have the conversation? If you're all sad about what happened to me, if you're not familiar, I was pushed out of Columbia University for calling out anti-Black racism and transphobia. And when you have a fear of open conflict, you don't invite the person that has been harmed. Right? You have a conversation about them behind closed doors. You talk about it, you make it a talking point. But other than that, you're not interested in actually resolving it. So yes, perfect example.
Well, obviously it's horrible what has happened there, and they're a huge loss. And I'm really sorry to you.
Thank you.
But I trust you're finding the next great thing that'll be even more incredible. Here's another question. Do you have suggestions and recommendations of resources for folks of color on how to navigate conversations around accountability without being accused of engaging in cancel culture?
Such a great
affirmation
question
from Joseph there. Joseph, we heard you.
So cancel culture is not real.
Right.
No one has been canceled that people claim that they are experiencing cancel culture. I was thinking about this today too, is that there's a lot of focus on cancel culture, which is the focus on the person that has been harmful rather than the harmed, right? There's the move to talking about cancel culture is a distraction to talk about folks who are harmful and oftentimes people who hold power, so they can continue doing that, so they can be absolved of the harm that they caused, and now they are being harmed, right? Which is just not the case, because all of the people that we've wanted to cancel, I believe Fulbright, we want to cancel, still has a freaking statue standing in the middle, right? And it's been 50 freaking years that people have been advocating for the removal. Trump, we said we were canceling Trump. I thought collectively went to go to impeach, acquitted the second time. Cancel culture is not a real thing. So you can just tell people that. But then what I also think about is, what is the care for the person who called out, right? Who called the situation out, right? What now? How are they being canceled? Because that's oftentimes what happens. That person is silenced, removed, fired from the situation, rather than there being care and consideration for how cancel culture impacts the person who's calling it out. So it doesn't exist, but I will say it does exist for most marginalized communities who speak, who call situations out, but it does not exist for white people by any means. Even if a white person were to lose their job, they could easily get another job somewhere else. So that it's just not a thing, and it's always a concern of white folks, something that's not happening to them. So it's really just when white people are saying this, or people who are protecting white folks, not all skin folk or kin folk, right? We have to see it as a distraction, right? We have to see it as, this is now you are trying to distract from the situation rather than focus in on who has been harmed. And who cares if they're canceled? Great. There's a consequence.
Yeah, Dr. Seuss, right?
Yeah, who
anyways.
cares? What? I've never seen so many people care so much about a damn children's book, please.
But it's that loss of our childhood favorites. Well, your childhood favorites are steeped in problematic imagery. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's so many new books, please give it a rest.
Yes, so true.
I think I have to run to the to the multicultural group, yes?
Okay. Tiana, how do you want to transition that? Oh, can you take one more question, Ericka? Do you think?
I think it's up to you folks. Can I take one more question? I don't know.
I let Tiana make that. I defer to Tiana.
Yeah.
I feel so powerful right now.
You are.
Yes, we can do one more question.
Okay, cool. Let's do it.
It's appropriate. It comes from the originator of this idea. The question is, you hit on AAVE, so African American Vernacular English, earlier. Can you talk more about how this has been appropriated by the mainstream?
Oh, yes. So African American vernacular, you know, the ways in which Black people talk and created a whole language from our survival inside of chattel slavery all up until present day. So I received an email not too long ago from an expensive furniture store that was doing a spotlight on lights. And the subject of the email said, "It's lit." And I thought, that's very interesting how this store that's owned by white people is using "it's lit," right? Which is African American vernacular. You know, people in white queer people will say, "Hey, queen," "Yes, queen." All of that is African American vernacular and they should not be saying it. I've heard white people say, "Hey, sis," or "Yes, sis." No, sis is African American vernacular. And that is terrifying that white people even say, like, in my bones, like I think of my granny saying "sis" like at church, and to hear white people say, I grew up around white people my whole life and they've never said "sis" or called me sis, right? That is your sister, maybe, right? Your real sister, but not your sis, right? So it's used so much. I mean, it's used to, it's what, you know, so many people have lodged the conversation around. You want Black culture, but you don't want Black people. So you have white institutions and white people using Black vernacular English, but that's not coming from a Black person. And if a Black person were to speak that way, they would lose their job, or they would be told that they're not speaking properly, or that they're using slang. Like if I wrote a paper right now, or if I received a paper as a professor that had Black vernacular English, I would be fine with that. But there's a lot of professors and English teachers or whatever that would be like, "This is not okay." But it's okay for all these other, you know what I mean? Like, it's just not, it's not making any sense. And it's never valued in the mouth of a Black person, but it's valued in the mouth of a white person, and that's a problem.
Yep. Yep. Lots of thanks and praise and gratitude.
Thank
coming in
y'all
the
so
chat.
much. Thank you. Yeah, I've been reading the chat. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I really appreciate all of you. You can, I'll put where you can find me. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram here. You can email me here if you have questions. I read my DMs, like all of them. So you can message me on Twitter or Instagram or email me, and that's the easiest way. This is my website. Cool.
I was trying to keep up with your plant game. You see my back here? I was trying to keep
see
up with
that.
I can't hang with your
You're doing
Tiana,
well.
Tiana, do you want to close us out?
Yes. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you again, Ericka, for just enlightening us with your unapologetically Blackness. Love it. Love to see it. And thank you all again for joining us. You are more than welcome to head out. Ericka, do you already have the link to the
I do have the
fireside
link.
chat? Okay.
Yep.
So CAPS team, multicultural team, go ahead and join us in the fireside chat in the next Zoom call. And just want to thank you all again for joining us. Y'all have a great day and see y'all next time.
Ciao.
Oh, stop the recording.